Welcome to episode 9 of the Alcohol Modex War Plan webinar series. As many of you now already know, I'm Richard Ritchie, and today I'm excited to be joined by Kevin Iwamoto. Iwamoto, I do apologise. I've rehearsed that so many times I got it wrong.
It's fine.
Kevin Iwamoto. Kevin is the current Chief Strategy Officer at Bizly and has also served as a global category leader at HP, Disney, as well as in executive roles at Starside, Active Network, and Lanyon. And he's got a wealth of knowledge and experience to share with us today around strategy as we prepare for the bounce back. So before we get started, for those of you that haven't already met me, as I said, my name is Richard Ritchie. I run a niche executive search and recruitment business based here in the UAE, and we also serve the Singapore market. Our primary focus is sourcing sales and commercial leadership talent for the IT channel industry. Now, typical roles we deal with include channel manager or director of channel, partnerships manager, director of sales, commercial director, VP of sales, country manager, and GM, just to name a few of the main ones we deal with. Now, I've spent the last 25 years building and leading high-performing sales teams, and I know how important it is to install the right commercial leader within an organization. And I understand this has got a direct impact on value, but also how quickly you can penetrate the market. But not only that, in times of crisis like we're in today, how important it is to protect the underlying revenue that we work so hard to generate during the good times, should we say. So if any of you like assistance or guidance in this regard, then please do get in touch after the webinar. Now, that said, obviously today is not about me, nor is it about recruitment. It's actually about you. And I'm specifically now talking to business managers within the IT channel industry. Now, over the past few weeks, I've spoken to many of you on the call today to get a better sense of what your top of mind challenges are in this time of COVID-19. Some of you have already become part of our mastermind community, and that's really been set up to tackle this crisis head on. So these top of mind challenges are really what's driving the content of this webinar series, and it's really my way of giving back to the community, but also really just as a way to bring the community together so we can set ourselves up to really thrive rather than just survive, and set ourselves up for growth once we bounce back. Now, over the last few weeks, we've held sessions already on things like how to keep a remote workforce engaged, the increased threat to cybersecurity born out of working from home, fast-tracking digital transformation, safeguarding reputation for a COVID-19, post-COVID-19 world, managing a partner ecosystem, business continuity, solving problems with AI, and turning crisis into an opportunity, which was our Singapore focus session just last week. Each week, as you know, we bring in different industry experts to help us piece together strategies to overcome these very real challenges. In the coming weeks, we'll be discussing change management, and also we're looking to get someone involved to discuss growing revenues in time of a crisis, which I know quite a few of you have actually articulated, a great interest. Overview of who you are for the people who don't already know you, and what you're currently doing at Bizly.
Thank you, Richard. So my background is, as you said, I've spent quite a lot of years both as a buyer as well as a supplier in the marketplace. The latter part of my career was really more focused around technology industries and different leadership roles within the industry, but I've done everything from sales through marketing through even being a senior category leader at HP. My portfolio there, I managed over $1 billion of corporate spend on a global basis, setting policies for programs, doing crisis management planning, strategic sourcing. I was involved in several key initiatives that HP tasked me to do. I was one of the lead integration managers when the acquisition of Compact came about. And I left HP around the time when they had acquired EDS and had elected to take a different role, actually on the supplier side, working for one of my preferred suppliers. So I moved over to the technology side as vice president of industry strategy, and spent quite a lot of years developing strategies around partnerships, strategic partnerships, and different marketing opportunities between companies, leveraging synergies between companies and ours, and really kind of creating a marketplace for our role within the industry. I left the technology industry and went into consulting, where I led development of a brand new vertical for a leading travel consultancy in the United States called Gold Spring Consulting. And I developed the meetings and events consultancy expertise arm for them, and grew it quite substantially up until the time I left to join my good friend Ron Shaw, who's the CEO of Bizly, as his chief strategy officer. But I'm also, because we're such a small startup, I'm also serving in a COO role as well as a CRO revenue role. So it's quite a busy role, different
Multiple
roles. Yeah.
Most jobs these days, I think, involve that, don't they? Especially with the younger organizations, right?
Yes, absolutely. You have to do, I think the key with a startup is you have, for someone like me who's had a very big corporate background experience working for large, medium-sized corporations, to move to a startup mode is really a very big change, because you really don't have people to execute. You have to kind of execute a lot of things and be quite versatile and quite flexible on your own. So for me, it's actually a very exhilarating experience, because I get to wear several hats at one time, whereas in a traditional corporate environment, you wear one hat. And you better stick to your hat, because somebody else wears another hat and you can't get into their business. But in a startup, I love the freedom of being able to contribute on multiple levels in different capacities. And I just think all of the years of experience I have just kind of rolled up quite nicely into serving me well in the current role as Chief Strategy Officer.
I think it's actually quite interesting when I talk to people who've worked in both successfully, that is, in both a large corporate enterprise and also a startup environment, because what I've witnessed is some people who are actually very good at executing, very good operating within a structured environment.
Yes.
Actually struggle within a startup environment, because there's a little bit too much ambiguity, should we say, a little bit too much freedom to do things, and without that structure, plates get dropped, things get missed, projects deadlines get missed. It can be quite challenging, let's say.
It can be, but I don't know. I guess if I look at the two, I would say, would I trade in the structure for a little bit more freedom and autonomy in decision making? And I think the answer to that is absolutely yes, because the thing that I did not appreciate in corporate was the highly regimented restrictions that you have to follow. You can't just make a decision. You have to build consensus, and you have to have a budget for it. And there's a whole bunch of other protocols and things that you have to follow. Whereas, in a startup, you kind of set the pace and everything yourself. It's a bit scary, because you're right, there's no structure to kind of fall back on or rely on. But on the other hand, the freedom is very exhilarating, because you really, when you do make changes, or when you do make decisions and they end up being successful, you honestly know that it was because of your decision and strategy that you're successful. It's not just the company. So I think that part is
100%.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Well, look, we want to really tap into some of that experience today from a strategy perspective. Now, we've always had a few conversations over the last few weeks about preparing for the bounce back, about the considerations that people need to bear in mind. And there's three, as we've discussed, there's three kind of pillars or strategies that people really need to bear in mind when they're planning, should we say, and those are just as kind of headlines, and we'll get into each one in a bit more detail now. The first would be, using the crisis period for out-of-the-box strategic thinking.
Yeah.
The second would be repositioning for the new normal,
Yeah.
and then the criticality of timing would be the third piece. So let's delve in now to the first one, which is using the crisis period for out-of-the-box strategic thinking. And guys, just for those on the call, in case I didn't mention it already, feel free to, it's just going to be myself and Kevin speaking on the call today. So if you do have questions or insights, please just type them in the chat box and I'll read them out. There's no need to wait for the end. I'll read them out as we go if there's anything you want to dive into in a little bit more detail, okay? So let's now get into using the crisis for out-of-the-box strategic thinking. Now, can you just explain exactly what you mean by out-of-the-box strategic thinking?
So what happens very often when we encounter crisis or situations like we're in right now is people become like what I call deer in the headlights. Everything has changed and they don't quite understand how much has changed, to what extent it's changed, how long is this change management going to last. And most people, out of their own fear of making different strategic thinking, through a crisis, they tend to kind of do a wait and see. So what they do is they kind of, instead of using the crisis period to kind of really think through what has happened, accepting what has happened, and then thinking through what's the world going to look like when this is all over or when it starts to wind down, they kind of go in what I call like this inertia period where they just are paralyzed by fear and they're not quite sure what's going to happen, so they don't do anything about it. They just kind of wait it out. And my point to them is, if you're waiting it out, you're actually losing a wonderful opportunity to really take another look at your current business, really under the hood, if you will, and see if your current business model, your current strategy, if your current configuration, processes, everything are still going to be relevant and applicable in the new world post-crisis. Because the one thing I do know about crisis from my own experiences, whether it's SARS or whether it was 9/11, in a leadership role, is if you're waiting to see before you are comfortable enough to make a decision, you're actually missing an opportunity to come out of the gate first. We'll talk more about that later when we talk about the other pillar. But you're you're wasting valuable time to really do a self-examination of what you're currently doing and how you need to change it in order to adapt to the new world when the crisis is over. So I always tell people, do what I call the onion exercise, right? You know how when you peel an onion, you come after layer and layer, and quite honestly, during the process, you're also shedding tears, right? You're shedding tears because the peeling of the layers is quite painful to the eyes, and so you're shedding tears. But when you peel an onion for business strategy, you'd be so amazed that the amount of layers that you need to peel to get to the point where you need to be to start building new strategies and processes. And trust me, like peeling an onion, you will also shed tears, but you're shedding tears for the loss of everything legacy-wise that you built. And now you realize you will need to change to keep your business going and growing post-crisis, right? So whenever people start discussing what the world was like before a crisis like COVID-19, what they really need to realize is that whatever they did prior to the crisis is now purely a baseline for past performance. It is not going to be relevant moving forward. And I say that because moving forward, especially when the future is unknown, is scary. But realistically, past performance and past benchmarks can't be used for forecasting because the world economy post-COVID-19 is going to change for everyone and every country, right? So it's going to be imperfect for at least a year. And at the end of the year or so, you will then have new benchmarks based on the new realities of doing business and generating revenue. And they may not look and be the same as you experienced pre-COVID, right?
It's quite interesting. I think that the theme here to me is, and I've witnessed this in a number of different interviews that I've performed over the last month, actually, is this difference in mindset. At the beginning of the crisis, there were, let's say, the majority of people who hadn't really realized the extent of the crisis, were kind of hoping that it would blow over. And I guess in the initial part of a crisis, you kind of do that, right?
Yeah.
As the period has kind of gone on and on now, more and more people have come around to the thinking that, okay, you know what, actually, we still want to be in business in
Yeah.
12 months, in 36 months, in 5 years, 10 years. So
Right.
there needs to be a point where we start to accept the need for change, and we have to make some decisions about what we envision the future to be, because, you know, what
Right.
we were discussing last night, we know we don't really need government intervention, or we don't need to wait for our competitors to take the lead. Now is an opportunity, I feel, for us to be leaders, because
That's
we
right.
know we have a handle on what the future is already, right?
That's right. That's right. That's absolutely
It's
right. And
whether or
you
not
know
we're willing to
the competitive
accept it.
landscape. Um,
Yeah.
right. And so there are some assumptions you're just going to have to make, and that's a leap of faith, not
Mm.
just like guessing in the wind, but really it's like you know what you know, and you know what you observe, and you can kind of make some pretty accurate assumptions as to what the world is going to look and feel like post-crisis, right? Like
Mm.
one thing, like I said earlier in comment, is after each crisis, there is change. There is change in the way that we do things, right? Like no one believed me after 9/11 when they started the TSA in the United States, and I was part of the task force that helped to develop that.
Mhm.
What would they be doing, and what would they be reviewing, and how would this work in conjunction with airports and airlines? And no one believed when I said, well, everybody's going to have to go through this massive pre-check, you know, of screening. It could be, you know, X-ray machines, you know, and you know, making sure that you're not carrying sharp objects and things like that. And everybody said nobody is going to have the tolerance to
Mm.
subject themselves to that kind of invasive screening before they get on a flight. They just won't do it. People won't fly. And actually, the opposite was true. People started to fly because they put those protocols in place,
Yeah.
because they felt safer, right? Was it a
Mm.
big change? Absolutely, it was a big change. But it was needed in order to get people to feel confident in flying again. And so we've changed and adapted after each crisis. And this will not be any different, you know, especially with what we're finding out about COVID-19 and social
It's actually,
distancing.
you mentioned that regarding the processing at the airport, and like you said, the
Mhm.
behavioural change and the
Yeah,
expectation from a let's say a user or consumer perspective, because I
right.
think that will be the same as this with COVID, for example,
Yeah,
because, you know, when we get to go back to work, I know
yeah,
in the UAE, for example, now I think you can have up to 50% of the staff working as normal in your offices. And I'm not sure
right.
I'm sure this is similar, different throughout the world at the moment, but ultimately there is a level of expectation from an employee now that, you know,
Yes.
are we doing okay? We're operating with a skeleton crew in the office, but is the office configured differently? Has our refectory changed in any way?
Yeah.
And I guess what's really interesting is is a point that Hans, who's on the call now, mentioned to me in a conversation yesterday. His question really was, you know, what is humans tend to forget pretty quickly, right? And I
Yes.
think this is part of our inherent defense mechanism, right? But
Right.
if we have the mindset of, okay, humans, we forget very quickly, we'll fall back into our old patterns fairly quickly, within 6 months or something.
Yeah.
If a company has that mindset, then they're also going to use that mindset in a way to resist the need for change to accommodate these new behaviors, right?
Yeah.
And that I think is perhaps the real danger. It's this resistance to change, or resistance to accepting the reality that we're now faced with, that we
Yeah.
know exactly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes. Will it be horribly inconvenient? Yes. But I think the biggest difference as a catalyst for change in this particular case, Richard, is the fact that if you don't do the right thing and you don't set up and configure the office correctly, you don't
Mm,
incorporate social distancing, you take away the food stations and the buffet lunch and all of those things, people could get sick and they could die. And
mm,
that's something that most companies really, being risk adverse for duty of care, safety and security of employees, are not willing to compromise on. So they're going to have to force that change, because
mm,
two things are going to happen. The first thing is, if the employees feel like the company is not adequately looking out for their own interests and safety and security. They just want to work, right? That's number one. Number two, the companies don't want to be held liable for negligence of their employees. If some of their employees get sick and they have to shut down, which is going to cause further delay in getting back to business and generating revenue. So there's a whole social consciousness that companies have to take into account that they cannot ignore, because to ignore could also cost them on the client side, right? If the clients, imagine the publicity being the employees are refusing to come back to work because they're accusing the company of not putting enough safeguard and precautions into the workplace and they don't feel safe. So if, let's say in manufacturing, or they're coming up with a service or a product, how many clients out there you think are going to feel comfortable with patronizing that company who's not taking care of their employees? And then they're going to wonder about the product or service that they produce, whether they've taken shortcuts there and are not taking the right precautions there either. So all in all, from a whole marketing and brand perspective, it's really a bad thing to not make the necessary changes in order for people to feel safe.
Yeah, quite right. I think it's interesting. I think the point I mentioned to you last night. So my brother has 3 young boys. I think they're 2, 10, and 12. So they're all in different schools, different age schools as well.
Right.
And they're looking to go back to school in September. And he's quite rightly nervous about this because there's no evidence that actually, other than waiting, that the school has actually changed anything about the way they operate, so that he doesn't really want his children to be part of, let's say, the first wave of guinea pigs that go back into the same environment that they left a couple of months ago. It's quite so. I guess from a business perspective, you've got both the employees and the consumers this is going to affect, certainly from a mindset point of view. Kevin, we have a question actually from Ian. I'll just read this out. So Ian has said, talking of travel policy, in particularly pre-screening, how difficult is it to set strategy when there is no clear international policy with different governments at the moment making different policies?
Yeah, that is a challenge, and I think until the world kind of comes up, I mean, eventually they'll get there, but right now, because no one is really taking a leadership role in kind of developing what those standard policies should be, you know, countries and governments and airports are kind of left to kind of design their own based on budgets and based on what they know. And Ian is absolutely right. You know, I think the world is just so ill prepared for what happened with COVID-19 that we're only now starting to think about, well, hold on a minute. You know, if the hotel safety standards are different per chain, what does that mean to me? You know, am I going to stay in one chain over the other because one has a better sanitization program than the other one has? I mean, so really we're now starting to reach a point where we're all realizing, both as consumers as well as an industry, that we can't have this kind of different rules and regulations all over the place. They kind of have to have some level of standardization. And it's really government getting together to kind of establish what that is, that, you know, we'll get there. I mean, if you remember, though, to answer Ian's question, that's kind of the way it was after 9/11, when you went to different airports, they had different screening protocols, right? Now, if you go to a lot of airports, a lot of the screening protocols are pretty based on the same commonality. You know, there's not that much radically different than it was when it first got rolled out and everybody was doing their own thing and developing their strategy. So that's exactly where we are now. And as this pandemic progresses, we're going to find more government organizations getting together to kind of standardize a lot of these things.
100%. So David's made a comment as well. So David has said quality leadership would be crucial to the resumption of business and the return to profitability for any enterprise.
Absolutely.
Yeah, 100%. That's the thing. Ultimately, there needs to be someone within each organization, whether it be an organization or a country, as you said, that actually stands up and takes the lead role, but makes decisions on behalf of others for the benefit of others also, I think.
Correct.
And sometimes that leadership role or that set of decision principles, let's say, may be overkill to some extent. You know, they may not. It certainly would be seen as overkill to competitors or other countries, let's say. But it's better to be safe than sorry. I think will ultimately be the philosophy of the people, looking back on how we've dealt with this situation. Just give us some examples then, Kevin, of perhaps business models that you're aware of that really do need to redefine the way they operate. I know we mentioned the other day when we were talking WeWork, for example, and food kitchens. Like how are these? Just give us some insight into how these, like, why is it important for these to now reconfigure their business model, let's say?
So when you look at those industries that really rely heavily on social interaction as part of their value proposition and revenue model, right? Such as these shared space companies, as well as food kitchens, even the illustrious Las Vegas buffet. You know, when you think about COVID-19 and how it spreads, and how those business models now have to reaccommodate the way they service people if they want to stay in business, because if you follow the original business model, you could get sick, you could die. So you know, if I were them, and I'm sure that a lot of them are already doing this, they're already strategizing on their return to business under a modified version of their existing business model. So they're actually probably peeling the onion and saying, you know, all the different layers that we need to change, and we need to shift behavior or shift configuration or shift process or policies around, because they now are contradictory to, or they could be endangering somebody's health and well-being. They're going to have to start to plan to change, to do, if they ever want to get people back patronizing them again. Right? And it's a painful exercise. I won't lie to you. If you've ever done one of these, what you find is every time, using another analogy, it's like a Russian doll, right? Every time you pop the top and you pull another one out, then there's another one in there, right? And it just keeps going. And that's kind of how this exercise goes, right? It's like you have to take the original strategy and business model, and you have to peel it away and find out all of the areas that are now compromising of public safety and security that might detrimentally harm you in terms of getting people to resume patronage of your business or your service again. And it's a painful exercise, because just when you think you have it all figured out, something else comes up, right?
I'd say sometimes it involves going, some companies will need to, like say, peel the onion a bit deeper than others. Hans has actually made a good point. He said a great part of the change will also need to come from big corporates, where the push for quarterly numbers should not prevail safety and health. And I think that will be a key issue for a lot of companies as well. I think, you know, as they all struggle to, let's say, protect revenues or get back to some degree of normality as far as revenue is concerned. There's that weighing up of priorities, right? And I'm sure they'll weigh up the cost implication or the risk analysis of if someone gets, it'll cost this. If someone, do you know what I mean? It sounds very harsh, but I'm sure these are the kind of conversations or decisions that have been making at the moment.
Yes, and also with that, you also need to figure out that whatever revenue model you had is basically in the toilet, right? Because now when you come back to business, depending on what type of business you're in, you're going to have to accommodate for masks for the employees and hand sanitizers and maybe offering them to your clients, and those things to be replaced on a daily basis, hourly basis, extremely costly. So you now need to start factoring that cost into your overall revenue model to accommodate for the additional amounts of money that you're going to have to spend to try to accommodate, you know, and make people comfortable that you're following all the safety protocols, and you haven't taken any shortcuts that might you know, unintentionally harm your clients or your customers.
Yeah, quite right. So just a comment from David. So firstly, the strategic decision-making and implementation of renewed ways of doing things, from customer engagement to sales process to marketing, etc. And then secondly, the way that the company treats its employees.
Yes.
Yeah, 100%.
Well, you know, okay, so let's talk about that. So now more than ever, companies just can't, well, let me rephrase. It depends on where you are in the world. but most companies really can't dictate to their employees that you must show up for work. Because if they do make that kind of ultimatum, there's a good likelihood they would lose a lot of talent, right? By people saying, I'm not going to come to work if my safety and my health is going to be compromised, you know.
Yeah.
Because I have to think in terms of my partner, my family, my children, my parents. It's more than just me, right? And so companies have got to really make it, well, put it this way: if they can't make their own employees feel comfortable enough to return to work, the workplace, then what chance do they have of convincing customers that they've made all the necessary changes so their product or services are now safe, right?
Yeah.
You can't convince your own employees that you've done all that you could to ensure their safety and their health and their well-being. You're not going to convince the clients to come back and patronize you either, right? And I also think, Richard, to your earlier point, if you notice in the U.S. in the stock market, more than half of the companies that used to put out their revenue forecast for the year or the quarter, they refuse to give forecasts.
Really? Yeah.
Because they really aren't sure yet of what the marketplace, you know, what their re-entry into the marketplace is really going to be able to do in terms of revenue generation. And so it's kind of silly to put a number out there where they have no clue or no idea on how they're going to even reach those numbers. So I think, you know, to answer the earlier questions, I think the fact that companies are reticent or reluctant to kind of put out a forecast number is actually a positive sign that they're not going to be as fixated on revenue generation and those reporting of those revenues to Wall Street for you know, stock price inflation and stuff. I mean, a whole bunch of other things right now they need to focus on, and that's not going to be, you know, the number one reason, if you will, for providing that number, that forecast.
You know, there were actually two companies I spoke with last week, and both of them said the same thing, in that their current operations are not tied to budget in the same way that is the norm. Let's say that doesn't mean they're spending money everywhere. It means there's no, they don't have that degree of clarity yet that that they can do so. It's a pointless exercise right now.
Yeah, so David, it really is a pointless exercise, right? So hopefully they'll take the time to re-strategize, reposition, reconfigure, you know, design new processes, and really get the confidence back of their employees to come back to work. And speaking of coming back to work, how our world, I see, is going to change most dramatically post-COVID is the actual bricks and mortar of the workplace, and having people coming into the office. You know, when you see a lot of CEOs and very exalted leaders on CNBC and other news, financial news services, you look at some of these CEOs who are really staunch advocates of having people show up into an office, and unless they're there, you know, we can't guarantee the level of productivity, or there might be compromises in work quality, blah, 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 blah. Almost universally, what I've seen and heard is completely the opposite from these same CEOs who are really adamant about having people come in and reporting in on a day-to-day basis in a brick and mortar environment. And what they're saying now is, you know what? 90% of our workforce now is virtual, and the work is not only getting done, the productivity has actually gone up. So what they're now thinking about is, do we really need to have that kind of financial investment in bricks and mortar? When we come back from this, can we be smarter? Can we save a lot of money, lease money, get smaller offices, and let more people work remotely, which also increases their work-life balance and their job satisfaction, right? So they're really rethinking the whole, you know, we must come back and group together. Now, there are some industries where that's absolutely necessary, but I'd have to say that if you really took a look at most companies, how necessary is it to have 1,000 people in a building?
Yeah, no, you're quite right. And I think it's actually quite interesting. You know, we spoke about this a couple of weeks ago when we were talking about using AI to solve business problems. One of the, I guess, if we were monitoring, let's say, performance effectively before this situation, we could now more accurately identify those that are perhaps more efficient by virtue of the fact that they're working from home.
Yeah,
Whereas to do it the other way around is almost futile, because someone can now return to the office and do nothing in order
yeah,
to prove that they're more effective at home, right?
yeah,
But it just implies that we should have the tools in place to monitor not just efficiency but effectiveness as well, right? Doing the right things
yeah,
at times, not just getting the right things done. Because the reality is, if someone is now working 12-hour days, to me that's not effective. They're getting the right things done, so arguably they're efficient, but there's still things that need to be managed to ensure that they're getting that work-life balance. There's just a couple of comments that I'll just throw in, Kevin. So David mentioned, so the culture needs to be inclusive. So staff will buy into severe changes in behaviour if they feel included. I think that's a great point, especially if we're talking about changes in the setup of operations or working environments. If they're involved in some way, then of course they're going to buy into it.
yeah. And I would also add, not just inclusion, but transparency. I mean, you have to, as a leader, you have to tell people why you're making certain decisions, and how that, how that will positively impact not just the bottom line, but their own work experience and the company culture. And a lot of times, a lot of employees feel like they have no voice. When you just give them a new policy and say, this is a new policy, please start following it effective immediately, right? But if you take the time to explain to them why the new policy came about, you not only get more a higher ratio of adoption, you also get people, employees actually supporting those decisions because they feel like you've been more transparent with them. So I absolutely agree with David that inclusion is important, but so is transparency.
So Fadi has just dropped a question here as well, which I think is quite an interesting one. So Fadi says, to comply with all these very important and must-have measures, obviously there's a cost implication. Yeah. So how would both clients and vendors handle this? Build up their budgets, and therefore the consumer will ultimately pay. Is I guess the question, right? Is this increasing costs going to be passed on, or should it be passed on to the ultimate consumer, or is it now just something that a company has to swallow?
I don't think that there's a hard and fast rule on that. I think depending on what your service or your product or your service is, will dictate to the marketplace, especially when there's pricing competition, as to how much consumer will be willing to take on versus how much the company needs to absorb. I mean, there's always a cost of doing business, right? But it's like right now you see most companies in a normal cycle would be preparing for their hotel sourcing RFP season, right? And the expectation when something like this happens is, well, the hotels really want the business to come back rapidly, so they're going to give us rock bottom prices. But what the naivete of that statement is, but their costs are not going to go down, they're going to go up, because if they have to accommodate all of the cleaning and the secure, additional hand sanitizers and masks and gloves for all of the employees, and reconfigure the properties and the health club and everything, so that the exposure to COVID-19 is minimized or eliminated. There's a cost to that, and so they can't give it to you at rock bottom, and so the cost needs to be shared by both the consumer as well as the supplier. And in this particular case, both have a vested interest in making sure that there are no shortcuts taken in creating those standards and those protocols and providing masks and gloves for the employees, because at the end of the day, if the employees feel like there's shortcuts that were taken either by the property or by the company, guess what they're going to do? They're going to stay at home. They're not going to travel, right? So there's an investment that both parties need to make to get people back traveling again and staying in properties without worrying that they're going to contract COVID and die. And so it's a mutual investment, and I think a lot of that comes out in the negotiation period. Like, we
Yeah.
would to give you a rock bottom price, but we just added costs, and we can't pay for all of this on our own. Some of it, or part of it, needs to come from the pricing structure, right?
And I think ultimately that kind of reconfiguration of prices to accommodate, like you said, this necessary change is unfortunately the thing that will probably push a lot of companies out of business, because they just won't be able to afford that. The reality is, if you were a market entrant at this point, it would be a completely different analysis, right? Because the cost of entering the market is now a lot higher. So from a new entry point of view, you're in a better position because you can decide not to. But from an existing incumbent point of view, then you have to accommodate and make these shifts that may impact short-term profitability. But in order to remain in the game, you have to do it. If you don't, then again, you run the risk of even perhaps more severe consequences, be it fines, penalties, whatever. The list goes on. But either way, the change needs to happen, whether you can afford it or not. I guess the question from a strategic point of view boils down to, are we willing to make that change and stay in the market? If not, how do we exit? Or how do we even perhaps reposition? And I guess this is the other point you make, which kind of straddling into the second point here as well now, is perhaps repositioning for the new norm. So it'll mean that some businesses actually change completely. So not only are they changing because their customer needs and employee needs have changed, but actually maybe serving completely different customers now.
Yes.
Because the business has had to be reconfigured so much that they're no longer the same business.
That's right. And what you're seeing now, which is slightly sad, but it's very understandable, is there were a lot of businesses pre-COVID that were borderline surviving, and a lot of that fell into the retail area.
Yeah.
They were really struggling selling in a bricks and mortar environment, and as evidenced by the demise of many shopping malls that used to be robust, full of people, and now less and less because more people are finding it more convenient to shop online. And so, unfortunately, what you're also going to see is survival of the fittest, Darwinism at its best, post-COVID, where certain industries, like you said, Richard, are really going to have to reconfigure and reposition for the new normal. And those who can't will basically fall away. And those who manage to pivot in the right way and reposition strategically in the right way are going to not only survive, but they're going to thrive in the new environment.
Definitely. But before we get into this, sorry, Kevin, go on.
No, I was just finishing a thought that, but this whole cycle of survival of the fittest has always been there. The catalyst may be different. In this case, what the pandemic did was it accelerated the demise of many industries that were kind of teetering and had a lot of unprofitability on their books for many years. And so it just basically is going to tip the scales and change everything, whether we like it or not.
So before we move into the final point, which is the criticality of timing, there's a few comments and questions that have come through, so I'll just quickly read these out. So David says, are we seeing a return to a sense of community? Are we seeing a new mindset considering the human element, ethical behavior, etc., and less of a ruthless focus on year-end numbers?
I would like to think so, and I'm going to be optimistic here, maybe naively optimistic, but I think with what's going on in the world, where the entire world was basically shut down in literally days, based on the discovery around COVID, its transmission, the lack of a cure, a virus, the potential of getting infected and dying from it, and the lack of medical equipment. The pandemic caught everybody very unaware. I don't think there was any country that was fully prepared to take this on. And even in the US, the arrogance in thinking that, oh yeah, we have a lot and we can make do with whatever happens, is just, fell apart on the first day when it was very clear that there wasn't enough tests, there wasn't enough ventilators, cities were prepared. There was no pandemic plan, that was universal for the country, and every state and every city was kind of left on their own, right? And the lack of leadership, is not only appalling, but I think actually added to the casualties, that we
Mm,
continue to see rise every day. Um,
mm.
but I just think that, with all of the human suffering going on, I mean, if you're living through this crisis like everybody else sheltered at home, how could you not feel a level of humanity that you want to go out, to try to be better and to try to solve? I mean, like what I find happening during crisis periods like this is it really brings out the best and the absolute worst in people. Right? But I
Yeah,
think for the majority of people, you're seeing people who have no money contribute to causes that are helping other people who are more in need. You're seeing
mm,
behavior, you're seeing people change their business models from profit to nonprofit to kind of feed people. You're seeing generous acts of humanity that, why does it take a pandemic or a crisis to make people do what's right and what they should be doing all the time, not just
yeah,
during crisis, right? I mean, so I guess what I'm saying is, I'm optimistic in thinking as long as this crisis exists, as long as there's a lot of very painful and visible human suffering going on, most human beings will react very compassionately to that. And I'd like to think that that compassion carries over into the leaders, such as the ones attending this call, and other leaders, and how they manage their companies and their workforce, and how they want to give back to the communities to help them versus just focusing purely on profit and the stock price. You will have some companies who it's part of their DNA. They're always stock price and revenue driven. But I think for
yeah,
the most part, what I've seen and what I'm liking what I see is there's a lot of compassion coming out of a lot of companies who are actually doing a lot more than they normally would because they recognize that it's the right thing to do in a time of such massive scale human suffering in the world.
yeah. We got a couple of I'll read one more out and then we'll move into the criticality of timing, just in the interest of time itself, actually. So Yanis has put a comment. So due to the current crisis and how COVID-19 has changed our business and personal life, the main strategy everyone is looking to is to reduce costs. To serve this strategy, it's clear that technologies must be implemented. However, we see that enterprises are confused in which pattern they should make the move. Should they invest based on the pandemic or on their normal business model? Is the pandemic-based transformation going to last for long, or will be useless after a short period of time? Do you foresee the same crossroad on post-COVID decision making? Another one is for opinion: work remotely or flexible models are here to stay. So I think just to kind of sum up with it, because there's quite a few points there. It's more around the so if we're modifying our strategy,
Mhm.
is this a short-term strategy or a long-term play? Is it, are we just firefighting the pandemic for the next 6 months? In which case, I guess if we hold that mindset, then more companies will think, well, let's not bother. We'll just wait it out. Or are we adopting this as a more long-term strategy to continue our business?
Yeah, so I don't have a crystal ball, but what I will say based on what I've read and what I've heard and things that experts that I've listened to is it can't be a short-term strategy. And why I say that is it's going to take at least a year to get a vaccine, right? Um,
Mm,
so we're in this for at least a year, possibly less, but not likely. And some of the new protocols that are put in place, some people are going to not want to give that up. The cleanliness and washing your hands and hand sanitizers and things like
mm,
that. I think the way that it's really changed us in the way we interact with each other because of social distancing. But if there's a vaccine or there's medical protocols that reduce the severity or the finality of the disease resulting in death, then you're going to see loosening up of things. But I would say, yes, there's some short-term changes that you have to make, but I think that the repercussions are actually longer term. because what I do know is after this, after there is a vaccine and after there are, enough medical equipment and ventilators and masks and, sanitizers and all those kind of things, is that the way we fundamentally interact and the way we go about our business is going to change, like it or not. It's based on what happened with this pandemic and what did we learn from it, right? Because human beings, we're learning creatures, right? We learn from everything that happens and we hopefully pivot to make improvements so it doesn't happen again, or if it does happen again, the severity of it happening is reduced because we learn something from it, right? The worst thing we can do is really find it almost borderline irresponsible is let's just wait and see what happens and then we'll figure it out. That is like the absolute worst thing you can do in something like that, because you're basically betting the farm on a proposition that nobody will back up or guarantee. I don't know of anybody who will guarantee and say that this will be over by May 30th, 2021.
Yeah.
Right? If somebody says that, you can kind of plan for that, but nobody has come forth and said an exact date of when this will be over. And even after a vaccine, like I said, is developed and the medicines are
that's a whole different process about how to get the vaccine to the masses anyway. So just when that in itself is a whole other
correct.
12 months or however long you want to, because again, different countries will have different protocols to follow, different views on how who
gets it first.
Yeah. So look, let's now fast forward to the last point for today's session, which is the criticality of timing, right?
Yeah.
So we've discussed using the crisis period to think out of the box thinking. We've discussed the need to reposition for the new norm. How important is timing here when we don't know when this crisis will be over or when the bounce back? Well, we're only going to know realistically when the bounce back has happened, right? It's the same when you look at the stock market. You only know the high or the low once you pass that time, right?
Correct. But here's the thing: nobody can accurately predict the bounce back because every country's level of COVID infections is so different. If you look at the United States, for example, we have the highest rate, of COVID. A bounce back is going to take longer because we have that many more people that we need to help, and we have that many more people that will be infected. And so that bounce back is not going to happen anytime soon. And I don't believe anybody who says optimistically, oh yeah, by next year we'll be back to no, they really don't know that. And even if we were to bounce back, the bounce back will be very small. It will be in stages. It won't be a big bang bounce back. It'll be very gradual, right? But here's the bottom line for this criticality of timing. So I'll just kind of flip back to this: is if your company is spending the time and peeling the onion, re-strategizing, repositioning for the new normal, right? And getting yourself to the state where when the bounce back happens in whatever country you're in, you are first out of the gate to kind of not only adjust to the new normal, but to also get out there and start marketing and promoting your company, right? Whether you're selling products or services. But you already have your marketing strategy all buttoned up, right? For the return to business. You already have your communication strategy. You already have your new business model that you may or may not have pivoted to or from. You've got all of your ducks in a row and you're ready to hit the marketplace. The sooner you do that ahead of your competitors, you've now created a chasm for them to catch up. And there's so many, like when you go to master's classes and you take all of these case studies, one of the things you see very common in a lot of these case studies is the companies that really did advance preparing and strategic planning and bounced back quicker than their competitors created such a distance between them and their competitors that was very hard for the competitors to catch up. In other words, they built a deeper moat around what they were doing because they were ready and first out of the gate. So I just want to say the criticality of timing is use the time wisely to prepare for that exit. And when the exit opportunity comes, jump for it, because the faster you are out of the gate and the more you have all of those things lined up, the faster you're going to return to business and the faster you're going to return to profit.
100%. I think that's a really key point to end on as well, because yeah, we don't. The last thing we want to do as business owners is to be caught flat-footed when, you know, I'll be honest. So a few weeks ago, this was at the beginning of Ramadan here in the UAE. When the government announced that they were relaxing the social distancing rules during this period, and it was an indication that things would be returning to normal, let's say, for argument's sake. It gave me a degree of anxiety, and I'll explain what I mean. It wasn't about this getting back into the public domain. It was more about, have I missed the boat? Have I missed the opportunity? Have I, you know, there is so much more I could have been doing these past few weeks. Yes. And it made me anxious, because I recognized the fact that, you know, now is the best time to be, like you say, doing everything you just articulated, rethinking about what our business model is, repositioning ourselves, re-engaging with perhaps old customers, getting closer to our existing customers. Correct. To ensure that they know that we're continuing to be relevant to them, because they can see that we understand them and we're willing to understand them, perhaps on a level that our competitors are not. And I think there's so many things we can do now as business owners to ensure that when we do bounce back, when things do change and move forward, we're ready to take the first step with our partners, which is obviously the key thing, right?
Yeah, absolutely right.
There's just a couple of comments I think I'll get to before we close. So Michael has said, agree, Kevin, for some businesses, they'll be forced to think more about efficiency and digital transformation. Yeah. 100%. David has said, so the issue of performance monitoring is a science in itself that is not that not many companies embrace or understand. I think for me, coming from I've always worked in the sales and commercial side of business, so I'm used to my performance, let's say, being scrutinized in a way that perhaps other disciplines are not. But I think the crisis does highlight the fact that everybody, no matter what you do, needs to be held accountable for results.
That's right.
I think measuring that will 100% be key going forward, and this perhaps has shone a light on that.
Yeah, absolutely.
Hans said, let's have a look. So Hans said, how come the huge profits the companies have been making pre-COVID disappear within just 2 to 3 months of COVID? So that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that.
Well, I mean, it really, I think that's a blanket statement, but I mean, there are some companies who actually are still doing okay. They had built up enough cash reserves, and they slowed their burn rate, adequately. I think the companies that lost so much money, I don't want to make generalities myself, but I would have to say, companies that continue to party and celebrate like the good times are never going to end are usually the ones that end up that way, because they haven't been wise enough to start to reinvest or put things on the side or diversify or do any of those very sound financial moves. And I won't single out a single vertical, but there was some verticals where they thought that people were never going to stop coming and patronizing their business, and so they just built more and more and more, and they never really put anything aside. And when the party stopped and everything shut down and nobody was patronizing anymore, they were stuck with all of this property, if you will, that no one was patronizing. And so they quickly went literally overnight from print money to basically hemorrhaging money, right?
It is quite interesting. I don't think we understand just how many businesses are operating in that way, right? They have a tremendous overnight expense, let's say, and they are inherently reliant on people paying for it. And as soon as those patrons are no longer visiting their stores, be it online, offline, wherever, the business model fails.
That's right. That's right.
And it's very easy for us to look at a company and think they made billions, but the reality is it almost misstates the success of a company if you just look at revenue anyway.
Yeah, if you just look at their stock price and you just look at the what they did with those assets. Did they diversify those assets? Did they make strategic acquisitions? And these types of different things. You can pretty much get a better look at which companies. I mean, I don't think it's any surprise that even during this pandemic, I don't think Apple has suffered greatly like a lot of other companies have. Why is that? Well, they've always had a huge cash reserve. So, they can wait out stuff like this. But most businesses are not Apple. So, it's really, to your point, Richard, it's kind of scary to think how many companies actually live that close to the fire or the danger line, and all it took was one little nudge and they just fell into the fire, and unfortunately there's a lot of companies like that out
there. Yeah, quite right. Well, look, I think that's all we have time for today. So apologies for people who haven't had their questions answered. Just to kind of quickly recap. So what we've discussed today is obviously preparing for the bounce back. 3 pillars, if you like, of that consideration being using this period, the necessity really to use this period for out-of-the-box strategic thinking about, and as Kevin mentioned, peeling back the onion, really asking questions about our existing business model that perhaps we've not had time to do in the past. And if that requires a degree of change or pivot, then understanding obviously what that pivot involves based on our interpretation of what the future will be. And one thing's for sure, we know already what the future is, right? We don't necessarily need to wait for a government or our competitors to tell us that people's behavior is fundamentally changed. It's whether we as business leaders want to take a lead. And I think the people that take the lead in this will stand to gain the most from that.
Absolutely.
Risk, I want to call it that. Yeah. The second thing was obviously repositioning for the new norm, which ties into the first, and obviously the criticality of timing, making sure that we do things now rather than waiting to be told you should have ended it last week. So planning right now in anticipation of the bounce back will make sure that I actually believe, although there are a number of organizations that have gone out of business already during this crisis, I believe there will be more businesses that go out during the bounce back period because they just haven't positioned themselves correctly. And by virtue of that same point, there will be a number of companies who have taken the time to do the things that we've mentioned today that will benefit, and there'll be a land grab. They will grab market share from places they never thought possible. So if you want to position your company in that way, then I think it's to take the advice you've received today, I think would be a great benefit. So look, thank you very much, Kevin, for taking the time. It's late. It's now midnight where you are. So thank you very much. It's clearly past your bedtime. So thanks very much again, Kevin, for joining us on the call today.
My pleasure. Thank you, Richard.
So just to kind of recap, so if you'd like, guys, a copy of the white paper that I mentioned at the beginning of the call, please just type white paper in the chat box, and one of my team will contact you in the coming days to arrange that once we've completed it. Also, if you'd like to arrange an informal chat about becoming part of our mastermind community, then please just type mastermind in the chat box, and I'll reach out to you personally in the next 48 hours to discuss that as well. Next week, we'll be joined by Inge Wallage, who, among other things, is the Managing Director of the European Association of Communication Directors, where we'll be discussing change management. So until next week, thank you, everybody. Good night, Kevin.
Good night.
And
cheers.
Everybody have a great day. Thank you very much.